You're listening to the USSC Briefing Room, a podcast from the United States Study Center at the University of Sydney, where we give you a seat at the table for a USSC briefing on the latest developments in US news and foreign policy. We'll cover what you need to know and what's beneath the surface of the news. Hello, I'm Mari Kirk, Director of Engagement and Impact at USSC, and we are pleased to welcome Dr. Will Inboden to USSC Briefing Room to talk about Cold War comparisons and Ronald Reagan. Dr. Inboden is Executive Director and William Powers Jr. Chair at the Clements Center for National Security at the University of Texas, Austin, and author of The Peacemaker, Ronald Reagan, the Cold War, and the World on the Brink. Prior to that, he spent many years working on policy in D.C. with the National Security Council and the State Department. So, Will, at the end of this episode, I'm going to ask you to share your favorite by the numbers fact or stat about Ronald Reagan or your book at the end. And I've been trying to guess what it might be, but I looked forward to seeing how close or far away I am. But before that, I'm keen to get your take on a number of things. So with the parallels that we see from the era during Reagan's presidency and today, from heightened tensions and shifting global dynamics to even looking at a Republican Party in a state of major change, this discussion does feel very timely for today. So I guess with the tension between in the academic world where challenges are considered with broader scopes and perhaps broader timelines, and the policy world where challenges are considered amid political realities and ever-shortening timelines, this is one we all know all too well at USSC. But with your PhD in history and preeminent academic accomplishments, as well as extensive government experience, including work across the White House, you're one of America's most accomplished scholar/practitioners. And of your many accomplishments, one includes writing the U.S. government's national security strategy in 2006. Few responsibilities require more academic and policy insight than producing such a document. So from your unique perspective, can you give us an idea as to the value of the national security strategy document and how U.S. grand strategy has evolved since World War II?
Well, it's a pleasure to be here with you, and I'm so honored to be hosted by the U.S. Study Center here. And of course, you know, your new leader, Mike Green's a longtime friend and colleague. I will issue the disclaimer that I'm certainly not worthy of all those accolades you were throwing at me in your introduction there, but I appreciate the warm welcome to Sydney. So the question about the value of the national security strategy and then the evolution of American grand strategy overall since the end of World War II. I'll first start with the value of a strategy document because I'll admit I had some of those same questions at the outset of the process of helping to craft the what was the Bush administration's national security strategy during the second term. And I was honored to work on that alongside my colleague Peter Fever, who was a fellow scholar detailed to the National Security Council staff. So in some ways I can speak for both of us there. But what I came to appreciate as the value of a strategy document like that were several things I'd point to. First, the mere fact of producing one forces the U.S. government to think more strategically, right? So the process itself matters. Now, in this case, we were fortunate to be serving President George W. Bush and a national security advisor, Steve Hadley, and then a very capable team of staff colleagues on the NSC, Mike being among them, who was leading Asia policy at the time, who were inclined to think strategically as well. But still, the very fact of producing a document like that, whatever one may think of the final outcome, it forces senior policymakers to get in the room together to think about how we want to articulate our sense of America's role in the world, what our priorities are, what the main threats are that we see, how we're going to address them. Also, what are the opportunities that we may see, and how do these different things fit together? So it almost forces you to come up with a theory of the case about what is the nature of the world that we're in and the United States' role in it, in that particular one. In this case, we were doing it at the height of what was known as the war on terrorism, right? So this is a few years after 9/11. There's still a very acute concern about the ongoing persistent threat of another large-scale mass casualty terrorist attack on the United States. We were in the midst of two hot wars in Afghanistan and Iraq at the time against that larger backdrop too. And so the threat of terrorism and America's response to it was kind of the governing paradigm that we are working with. And so the strategy document forced us to articulate what, our longer term strategy was there in addressing that. But this was also against the backdrop of real shifts in the global balance of power and early signs of what we're now living through now in this year 2023. But this is back in 2005, 2006. We're working that early signs of a resurgent and somewhat hostile Russia, and early signs that our engagement strategy with China was not bearing all the fruit that had initially been hoped of a more responsible stakeholder on the international scene, of some political reform, some of the other improvements that we are hoping to see in China. And so part of the strategy process also forced us to take a look about what do we see as the trend lines or our projections about where our relations with great powers like Russia and China are going. Another important part about producing a strategy like that is you do have to think historically. You have to try to situate. You're not just looking at what do we think is going to happen in the future, but situate yourself in the stream and the certain continuities of the past. And so we looked very much to the early Cold War, America's first debut on the global stage as an international leader, as a new superpower in the late 1940s and early 1950s. And we self-consciously look back to parallels from that time to the one that we are in that. In the early 2000s, again, times of tremendous international flux and shifts in the system. I'll come back to that in a second. Your question about the evolution of American strategy. Another important part about doing a strategy document is it forces you to think about the multiple audiences for it. In this case, and I could give entire mini lectures on each of these audiences I want. I'm just going to rattle through them, and hopefully our listeners will appreciate this. So the strategy is mandated by an act of Congress, and so Congress is one of the main audiences because they are funding American national security and national strategy. They're funding our defense, our diplomacy. They're writing a lot of the laws governing it, and so Congress wants to see what's the executive branch doing with strategy. What we call the broader interagency, the different cabinet departments and agencies in the United States government responsible for national security, down to the desk officers at the State Department, the analysts at CIA, the enlisted troops deployed on the front lines around the world. This is also a document for them. It's kind of a blueprint from their commander-in-chief, the president, saying, here's what my priorities for American national security are, and here's how all the different important things that you are doing fit into that broader strategy. So it's a blueprint for people who may be working on an individual issue. U.S.-India relations, U.S. trade policy, U.S.-Africa policy, to understand how it may fit into the bigger picture. And of course, foreign governments are an important audience for this too. The main parts of the strategy were unclassified. There were some classified parts, but the main parts of it were unclassified. And it is a message to the world about how the United States sees its role and then sees the importance of its allies fitting in. And then, it's language about some other states who may be emerging concerns or even adversaries. We had some strong language in the strategy, for example, on Iran and North Korea, and some warnings on China, as I had mentioned. So those are the audiences, and those are the purposes of it. Then, just briefly, as far as how American grand strategy since the end of World War II has evolved, I generally identify 4 different phases. So there's the Cold War phase, when the main strategy paradigm is containment, trying to contain any further expansion of the Soviet Union. And that goes through different iterations, but that's the main strategic framework for about 4 decades, really. After the peaceful end of the Cold War and the collapse of Soviet communism into the 1990s, we move into the second strategy of enlargement, which is where the United States was trying to engage and enlarge the number of market democracies in the world to help integrate former adversaries like Russia at the time, an effort to integrate them into the international system, expanding the G7 to the G8, for example. Efforts to also integrate a rising China, but still a communist power, into this broader international order. We could come back to what worked and what didn't about that strategy. The third phase is post 9/11. It's the counterterrorism era. The strategy, I would say, there is protection. The whole paradigm is protecting the United States from any further terrorist attacks. And then the fourth phase is the one that I think we're in now. Started in the last 5 or 6 years ago, of great power competition. And so that the paradigm there is competition. I think that at the time that each of those four strategies was developed, containment in the late 1940s, engagement in the early 1990s, so on, they were considering the other options the best paradigms we could embrace, right? And each of them had a number of successes we can point to. But one of my mantras, if you will, is that in a fallen, imperfect world like we're in, there are always going to be difficult trade-offs. There's always going to be downsides. There's always going to be risks. There is no such thing as a perfect strategy that will exploit every opportunity and solve every problem. And every strategy will have within it some weaknesses or deficiencies or downsides. And so we should not be utopians and think that we can eliminate all those, but rather those just need to be managed. And so my critiques, if you will, of some of those strategies is not so much that it was the wrong paradigm at the time, but that we did not have built into it enough testing of those assumptions or questioning about what are new indicators where this strategy might not necessarily be fully working until we had started to see some of the downside costs of it. But a lot of strategy is about managing problems rather than necessarily solving or fixing them. So anyway, I know I threw a lot out there, but I hope your listeners will find that it's a good grist for the mill for further conversation.
No, it's great. Thank you. I think it's a great thing to get a deep dive on all of that. And I'm keen to it's great to understand both those phases, and that maybe some of the different decisions they made were not inherently mistakes, but if they maybe should have had more robust questioning and those strategic thinking imbued into the design of those strategies. But I'm keen to take a deeper dive into President Reagan in particular, and looking very much at that Cold War to post-Cold War, I guess, a transition and that end phase of the Cold War, really. You wrote a very excellently reviewed book on Ronald Reagan's foreign policy. Can you give us an idea as to how his approach during the Cold War was different to his predecessors? And was it just simply a matter of outspending or outlasting the Soviets?
Yes, well, this is a great segue from what we were just talking about, the broader, sweep of the different phases of American strategy, because when Reagan comes along, when he is elected in 1980 and takes office in January 1981, a big part of his presidential campaign was his critique of what he saw as the inadequacies and limits of that containment strategy. And to give some of the outlines here, so containment, as I mentioned earlier, had been predicated on stopping further expansion by the Soviet Union, keeping them, somewhat contained, if you will, avoiding a hot war with them, but also not conceding even more global influence and control as they were seeking. But Reagan's concern by the 1970s is, to oversimplify a little bit, that containment had somewhat run its course, where it had shifted into this, what was known as détente of the United States trying to reduce tensions with the Soviets. But Reagan saw that this really, he worried that this amounted to essentially losing as slowly as possible. But that is still losing, right? And what had happened is a number of the broad foreign policy expert community had come to accept the Soviet Union as a permanent fixture on the geopolitical landscape. The Soviet Union had been around for 70 years or so at that point. It appeared strong, robust, resilient. We had some sense that its economy wasn't perfect, but it seemed like it could keep bumping along for decades longer. And so the governing American paradigm was like, let's just manage relations with this rival great power. And the belief was that the Cold War was essentially a great power contest, a standoff between two strong nations, the United States and Soviet Union, that happened to be have an ideological component or a battle of ideas between these two. One's a democracy and one's totalitarian, obviously. Well, Reagan rejects most of those precepts and assumptions. He believes the Soviet Union is more weak and vulnerable. He does not accept it as a permanent fixture on the geopolitical landscape. And he reverses that equation. He sees the Cold War as primarily a battle of ideas that happens to be laid on top of a great power contest. So he sees both elements there too, like others did, but he privileges that battle of ideas part. And from that, it follows that he does not see the Soviet Union as a rival nation to be managed. He sees it as a vile idea to be defeated. And he particularly wants to see the defeat and the ending of Soviet communism. And so he has this kind of punchy aphorism about this. His theory of the case in the Cold War is we win, they lose, right? And that's effective on the campaign trail. But I think if we take a deeper look at that, there's a much more sophisticated strategic recalculation going on there. The belief that the Cold War is not the permanent state of international relations anymore, but that it's possible for the United States and the free world to prevail. And it's also possible for the Soviet Union to be brought down. So that's where he does start to shift away from that broader containment paradigm into more of a rollback one. But it's also very important to appreciate he is still committed to keeping the Cold War cold. Okay, he is terrified of nuclear war. He does not want a more confrontational posture to turn into a hot war between the United States and Soviet Union. He knows that could quite literally mean the extinction of the human race, right? The complete destruction of the planet in a apocalyptic nuclear exchange. And so he devises I think a pretty sophisticated strategy that has those two prongs of increased pressure on the Soviet system, but also diplomatic outreach, of offering that diplomatic off-ramp. But he wants to negotiate from a position of strength. And that gets to finally your question about the role of his military expansion, the defense buildup in this. And yes, he certainly invests a lot more money in the Pentagon, close to doubles their budget over the next 8 years of his presidency. But for Reagan, it's not just about outbuilding and outspending the Soviets, it's about outsmarting them. And with his defense modernization, and that's why I always say modernization rather than just expansion or buildup, he's trying to invest in the next generation of weapon systems that will take advantage of American technology and be qualitatively better than anything the Soviets can deploy, rather than just trying to match them quantity for quantity, ruble for ruble for dollar, so on. And so his goal is to lure them into an arms race that, on its new terms, they cannot compete. They cannot win because it's not just about resources. It's about this entire new generation of advanced weapons. And we could do a whole other podcast just on the details of that. But for Reagan, that he wants the defense modernization to put economic pressure on the Soviets, but also to strengthen his diplomatic hand so that he can avoid that hot war. And instead, when the Soviets see this fearsome new advanced military the United States is deploying, they will feel induced into constructive negotiations. So that's an important part to appreciate about his strategy.
Wow, that's really interesting. And as you were talking, I was just thinking about there's so many things I hadn't necessarily thought of that do link quite directly with where we are right now. Even as you were talking about the assumptions that they had during the Cold War and that last stage and around it's this great power contest, but how Reagan reframed it as really a battle of ideas. Now we look at the state of geopolitical tensions, especially in this region, and the layers of economic coercion, but also, again, an era of this great strategic power competition. How similar to or different to Reagan's era or the Cold War era do you feel we are now? Because a lot of people are making those comparisons. How similar is it, and what lessons could we take from that? Is right now a battle, is it about economics? Is it about coercion? Is it a battle of ideas? Where is it, and how similar or different is it to where we were during the Reagan years?
Yes. So I'll give my bottom line up front, but then listeners, stay with me as I caveat and nuance it, right? My bottom line up front is I think there are more similarities than differences, and I will now say I do think we are in a new Cold War with between China and the broader free world or the West or the democracies and other rival nations of the Indo-Pacific. However, it is important to first lay out some differences, between the new Cold War we're in now and the first one. The main one that we always have to point to is the profound levels of economic interdependence between the United States and China, between Australia and China, right? Between Japan and China. Those you did not have those levels of economic interdependence and relationship between the Soviet Union and the free world during the Cold War, right? So that is a very important distinction. A second distinction is China does not have a comparable Warsaw Pact, right? So the Soviet Union had Warsaw Pact, these the coerced vassal states at the time of Central and Eastern Europe who were serving as a buffer, who were really imperial possessions of the Soviet Union with, imposed communist regimes there. But that's, very much the fulcrum of a lot of the Cold War. China doesn't have anything comparable. Another difference is China is not trying to promote Xi Jinping thought as a global ideology the way that the Soviet Union was trying to promote Soviet communism as a global ideology. China is not supporting armed communist revolutions around the world the way the Soviet Union was supporting them through Latin America and Africa and East Asia, for example. However, I do think that there are enough other similarities that there are some lessons I think we can look to from the Reagan era for now, and it starts with just kind of the geopolitical setting is then as now. We face the challenge of a nuclear-armed communist superpower on the Eurasian landmass, right? Before it was the Soviet Union, now it is the People's Republic of China. Right? There's only been 2 times in world history that this has happened. One was the first Cold War, one was the second one. Another is that it is a contest that is playing out across the globe as a contest for influence and is using all elements of national power, right? So there's certainly the economic dimension of the contest. There's the political diplomatic one, as China is jockeying for influence with African countries, with Latin American countries, certainly here in the Indo-Pacific. And it is still cold in terms of the United States and China are not in a hot war right now, and we certainly want to avoid that, almost at all costs. So that's another similarity. And then finally, I still think that it is a battle of ideas. I mentioned earlier that China is not trying to promote its ideology globally in the way that the Soviet communism did, but just taking Xi Jinping seriously and on his own terms and looking at his words, he's very much positing this as a contest of ideas. I mean, he says, his rules, starting with Xi Jinping thought, starting with the ideology of the Chinese Communist Party, as very central to his legitimacy as a core part of what he is trying to protect. This is a Leninist party system with the party over and above the state and the military. And as our friend and colleague Aaron Friedberg of Princeton has put it before, Xi Jinping's goal is to make the world safe for autocracy, right? To make the world safe for authoritarianism. And one reason why he has identified the United States and our friends and partners as his principal adversaries is he does not like the ideas and values that we stand for, of the liberal international order as it's known, of self-determination, of open markets, of some sense of self-government. So, the final thought on when we drive this thread back to our discussion about assumptions, 20, 30 years ago, the prevailing American strategic assumption, which I think was probably shared here in Australia and Japan and elsewhere, was that, two key points. One, that as China reformed and modernized economically and was, brought into the international economic order, that it would reform politically. And as we'd seen with the peaceful transitions from formerly communist countries to market democracies in Central and Eastern Europe, we hope that they would follow that path and that they would become a more responsible stakeholder, if you will, like a more responsible and constructive member of the international community. And second, we believe that they would, as they rose, largely be a status quo power, that they would embrace the international order that they had benefited from so much already, and that continued to exist. They would just be a more powerful member of it. And we see now both of those assumptions were wrong. First, the economic engagement and growth did not lead to political reform and better international behavior. It just made them, it made them richer, but also made them in some ways more belligerent and aggressive. And second, they are clearly now a revisionist power. They are trying to shift the terms of the international order, where China becomes a much more dominant player and can set its new versions of rules. Certainly inimical to American interests and Australian interests and the interests of a lot of other nation states in the region.
Right, thank you. I want to pick up on your point in this new battle for ideas and how Xi Jinping wants to make the world safer for authoritarianism and that form of power. It's hard to hear that and not think about the ties that we see in the Russia-China relationship developing. How do you see that evolving Russia-China relationship as a factor in both the Ukraine conflict and also in Taiwan?
Yeah, this has been this growing, first condominium and now even, partnership with, quote, no limits between Russia and China is a very big story. So first, to put it in historical context, the ties between Moscow and Beijing are their closest now since the 1950s. The last time we saw such, close affinity and partnership was in, the very early days of the People's Republic of China, after it had been, supported and sponsored by the Soviet Communist Party in the Kremlin. And so that right there tells us we're in, not quite completely unprecedented times, but we've not seen this particular geopolitical configuration in 70 or 80 years, especially because historically these two countries have been more rivals, right? They had not had deep partnerships in the past. So it's surprising. And it is driven certainly in part by a shared ideology, right? A shared commitment to authoritarian rule, a shared hostility to the market democracies of the world, a shared hostility to other states who do not want to be, dominated by Moscow and Beijing and their particular designs on how the world should work. And so, some of it is perhaps shared interest that has brought them together, but it really is that shared ideology too. And so this is why I've said in another context, what happens in Ukraine will be very influential on the future of what happens in the Indo-Pacific and certainly in East Asia. And that's why I think, a lot of countries here in the region are watching very closely to see what happens in Ukraine. As China has continued with its support for Moscow, it is invested in, some sort of successful outcome for Putin's aggression there. Of course, the Ukrainian resistance and the way it's galvanized Western support in turn has been watched very closely by Taiwan, I know, and of course by Beijing as well, as they're assessing the future of the cross-strait relationship and certainly the future of some sort of autonomy and self-determination for Taiwan. And then in turn, were Putin to prevail in Ukraine, I think that would very likely not be the end of his aggression. It would put a lot of the rest of Europe at some risk of where he might turn next, maybe one of the Baltic states or Moldova. And insofar as the European Union is, by some measures, China's largest trading partner, insofar as the United States and Australia and Japan hope that our European friends and allies will be important partners for us in countering China, if we leave a defeated or festering a conflict in either a defeated Ukraine or a frozen conflict there in Ukraine in their backyard, and Putin's aggression and somehow seems to pay off, that will certainly diminish Europe's appetite to partner with us here in the Indo-Pacific on the challenge of China. So, as I've said before, you cannot hermetically seal off one region of the world from others, and we cannot treat the Indo-Pacific as completely isolated from what is happening in Ukraine. Of course, Prime Minister Kishida in Japan has been very, very eloquent on this, saying, what happens in Ukraine today will be happening in Asia tomorrow.
Great. Very fascinating to hear about and think about these very real salient issues. And I'm just thinking we're in the context of a lot of big political announcements happening in the Republican Party at the moment. And as someone who's worked both in a Republican White House and with Republicans in Congress, and you've briefed a number of high-profile Republican politicians, where do you see the Republican Party? Where do you think it's headed in terms of both foreign policy? But then I'm keen to get your thoughts on it just more broadly going into the 2024 election and beyond as well. But I think if we look at China, if we look at Ukraine, and there's a lot of testing of this resolve, where do you think it's moving in your understanding of the Republican Party at the moment?
Yes, boy, a big question there. And I, as I was saying to a colleague the other day, this is currently one of the most uncertain kind of influx political landscapes I've lived through in my lifetime, both within the Republican Party, but also even thinking about the broader 2024 election landscape. So I cannot sit here and make any predictions. Whatever I predict, I'm sure will somehow be wrong. It's just very uncertain. But on foreign policy, the Republican Party is going through a very noisy, messy, but important internal debate about what is its, actually, I'll even say what's I'm a Republican, stance on foreign policy. Now, the historian in me can point out that this has been something of a repeated cycle, right? I could go back, I won't give a lengthy disquisition on this, but I could go back to the earlier turn of the century, right? The 1890s, early 1900s, early 1900s, 1910s, and trace out that almost like clockwork, every 20 to 30 years since then, there has been a bigger internal debate in the Republican Party to oversimplify, roughly between the more internationalist-minded wing that sees an important role for the United States on the global stage, exercising international leadership, projecting power, engaging with allies, so forth, and the more, there's different labels for this: isolationist, nationalist, unilateralist, right? Segment of the party, which prefers to focus more on America's needs at home, is more suspicious of engagement and leadership abroad, and so on. Obviously, I'm speaking in generalities here, but we could go into a lot of detail. So in that sense, we're living through one of those new cycles. I do hope that readers of my book on Reagan's foreign policy will see it not just as an interesting historical account, but also an account of a recent, very successful Republican president who was committed to allies, to promotion of human rights and democracy in an open trading order, to international leadership, to standing firm against an authoritarian foe, who believed in more open engagement in the world. Certainly was looking out for America's interests too, right? And was actually quite prudential and cautious about the use of force. Reagan was not trying to go around starting new hot wars in the world, but really believed in that integration of military power and diplomacy. And I think that even though he was a product of his times, and I said, we're not living through those identical times again, that there are enough enduring principles there that, I hope it can be something that the current generation of Republicans looks to and think, all right, well, those policies seem to work out pretty well. They weren't perfect. They seem to work out pretty well. And so when, today's Republican voters are thinking about this, I think that a lot of them are feeling somewhat whipsawed, right? There's certainly some discouragement, understandably so, over the unhappy outcomes in Afghanistan and Iraq, and questions about the tremendous blood and treasure the United States spent there. But also, I think there's an awareness of the growing threat from China, and certainly from Russian aggression, and the realization, well, we cannot just sit back behind the false security of our hemispheric repose, if you will, right? That, as Reagan would often say, we have our troops stationed over here in Europe because we know we need to meet threats over here before they come to our shores. I'm paraphrasing there a little bit. So I can understand at one level maybe the appeal of withdrawing or disengaging from the world, or not wanting to spend as much in the military or be as devoted to allies as we do. I understand some of the political appeal of that. But when you consider what that leads to, when you consider the vulnerability it puts the United States in, when you consider the potential costs and risks it bears, I certainly hope my fellow Republicans will come around to seeing the importance of an internationalist wing again. The main proponent of the more isolationist one, of course, is Donald Trump, who certainly has his devoted followers. But without going into all the others, it seems like most of the other likely or declared Republican candidates have some sort of broader commitment to internationalism and that Reagan legacy.
One of my favorite things when I'm talking to a historian is I can always remind you that the state you find yourself in right now is not unique. It's happened before, and you can point to some time in history. History is often cyclical, and that context could really help you have a better understanding of where you are now. And I find that helpful even if we look at the Republican Party and all the questions at the moment. It's nice to know, oh, they've been here before. This is not unprecedented. I'll be interested to see where it goes next. Now, as I mentioned at the top of the episode, I'm keen to get by the numbers, fact or stat from you related to either President Reagan or your book that's out. Do you want to tell us what you chose for your by the numbers fact?
Sure. The number I'm going to pick is 0. And I will tell you why. 0 is the number of intermediate range nuclear weapons that the United States and Soviet Union possessed after Reagan and Gorbachev negotiated and signed the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. And I bring this up because it is really one of Reagan's signature accomplishments. And it still is the only treaty in history that abolished an entire class of nuclear weapons. And the intermediate range, without getting too technical, the intermediate range nuclear weapons were particularly dangerous and destabilizing because of their short flight time until they would hit targets, because of their mobile nature. And when the Soviets had deployed theirs, both in targeting most of the capitals of Western Europe, but also targeting most of our allied and partner capitals in Asia, right? Targeting Tokyo, targeting Seoul, targeting Beijing at the time. It was absolutely terrifying. And so when President Reagan then deployed America's intermediate range nuclear missiles to counter those, it was a very frightening moment in the Cold War. People thought, it was in some ways we came as close to nuclear war then as we hit since the Cuban Missile Crisis. But Reagan did that as part of his bigger diplomatic vision to eventually eliminate all those weapons. And he knew that you first needed to threaten to throw a big punch to create the conditions for diplomacy, but certainly for his ultimate vision of reducing, even eliminating the threat of nuclear war. And so the fact that he and Gorbachev, the United States and Soviet Union, were able to get to 0 confounded all the critics and skeptics. It remains one of the most remarkable diplomatic achievements, I think, in American and world history. So that is my number for you, 0.
Fascinating. Thanks. I learned something and I didn't realize that, but that's quite exceptional. I thought you might do something about Ronald Reagan's sweeping victory in his second presidential campaign, which was also quite remarkable by the numbers.
Yeah. Oh, there's a lot of other numbers I could have given you, or the number of words I had to cut from the first draft of the manuscript to get the book down to size. So yes, but I think 0 is the one that best captures that part of his legacy.
Oh, it's fantastic. Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us today. I've really enjoyed getting to look into these issues, understanding more about the topic and really how then we can apply those lessons for today. I'm leaving feeling more optimistic and hopeful, and I really appreciate that. So thank you very much.
Thanks. I very much enjoyed it.
As we wrap up, I'd like to point out a couple of other podcasts that may be of interest. We have our Technology and Security podcast, TS, run by Dr. Mia Hamandari, USSC's Director of Emerging Technology, as well as our USSC Live series that runs recordings from our major live events. Recent episodes include our interview with Qantas CEO Alan Joyce and discussion with former U.S. Ambassador John Barry, our researcher responses to the AUKUS report, and our panel discussion with the cast of Hamilton, Australia. You can find these on our website, ussc.edu.au, or wherever you get your podcasts.